возобновления нашего диалога, восстановления отношений.
Yani Suriye'ye barışı getirme noktasında en önemli aktör birinci derecede Rusya Federasyonu'dur.
Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has chosen Russia for his first foreign visit since the attempted coup last month. The relations between the two countries were badly damaged after Turkey shot down a Russian military jet over the Syrian border in November. But 9 months later, the bitter war of words has stopped, and both countries appear to be on the road to reconciliation. Vladimir Putin was one of the first foreign leaders to call President Erdogan immediately after the July 15th failed coup, a welcome show of support in contrast to certain Western leaders who've instead proven critical of Erdogan's post-coup response. But while it should be easy for Ankara and Moscow to restore their economic ties, it might be more difficult to find a common stance on Syria as they continue to back opposing sides. On today's Newsmakers, we ask, how can Russia and Turkey reset their relationship?
It was a catastrophic way to fall out with a near neighbour, to shoot one of its planes out of the sky. Turkey's downing of a Russian jet last November led to a breakdown in relations between the two countries. There had been warnings issued in the weeks beforehand.
Whoever violates our airspace, despite the continuous warnings and the declarations of engagement rules, it is our international right to take any precautions against it.
Today's tragic event will have significant consequences, including for the relations between Russia and Turkey.
Very quickly, Russia imposed economic sanctions on Turkey and cut off all charter flights between the two countries. It reduced the huge number of Russian tourists visiting Turkey to almost zero. At immediate risk was trade worth an estimated 30 billion a year. But this is a complicated affiliation. It may have been severely rocked by November's events, but it was always going to be revived one way or the other. There are too many valuable common interests, and recent domestic events in Turkey may have helped. Vladimir Putin was one of the first foreign leaders to phone President Erdogan and voice his support after the coup attempt of July the 15th. A contrast perhaps to the perceived cool reaction from Western leaders.
We also discussed this morning the unfolding situation on the ground in Turkey. A NATO ally, obviously, and a key partner to the EU. We stand squarely on the side of the elected leadership in Turkey.
Despite the words, Ankara didn't feel the Western powers were quick enough to offer full support. It's on the back of a huge wave of national support that President Erdogan is making his first overseas trip since the coup attempt. And it's significant that it's to Russia, marking a dramatic upturn in the political relationship, one that was characterized only a few months ago by the trading of diplomatic insults. It's seen as a fresh start, a new beginning to the relationship.
Тем ваш сегодняшний визит, несмотря на очень сложную внутриполитическую ситуацию в Турции, говорит о том, что мы все хотим возобновления нашего диалога, восстановления отношений во имя интересов народов Турции и России.
But there are still serious and deep-lying differences between the leaders, despite the smiles. Not least the backing of different sides in the Syrian war. Bashar al-Assad has been strongly supported by the Russian military, while Turkey has been implacably opposed to Assad since day one of the war 5 years ago. Now things may be changing, possibly prompted by Russian success on the Syrian battlefields.
Şunu çok açık net söylemem lazım. Yani Suriye'ye barışı getirme noktasında artık en önemli adım, en önemli aktör birinci derecede Rusya Federasyonu.
And while the liaison between Turkey and Russia may still be in the thawing process, the relationship between Turkey and its NATO ally, the United States, remains strained. The visit to St. Petersburg is being watched very closely in Western diplomatic circles. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss where Turkey-Russia relations are headed is in the studio Ahmet Yükleyen. He is professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Commerce University. Joining us from Tripoli, Lebanon is Jana Jabur, research associate at Paris Institute of Political Studies, or Sciences Po Paris. And from Moscow is political analyst from Sputnik International, Dmitry Babich. Thanks all so much for joining us today. First things first, Turkey had been looking to reset its foreign policy approach even prior to the July 15th coup attempt, i.e. Israel reconciliation, arguably I say, apologizing to Russia. But would the tone of this meeting in St. Petersburg be what it is had it not been for that July 16th phone call from President Putin to President Erdogan? Ahmet.
We can say certainly not. We know that the direction was heading in the right direction, I guess, to improving relations with the neighboring countries and the important actors in the area. But certainly the response, the quick response in support of the elected government in Turkey by Mr. Putin had an important effect on the government and Mr. Erdogan, and his support in return, we could say, for this improving of the relations between these two countries. So it definitely increased the impact of the urgency and the desire to fix and improve the relations between the two countries.
Okay. Jana, let me ask you, would the two be where they are today had it not been for Putin reaching out in the immediate aftermath of the attempted coup?
Yeah, in fact, I think today there are structural and contextual elements that explain this rapprochement between Moscow and Ankara. The structural element is something that doesn't have to do with the coup d'etat. The structural element is that today both Turkey and Russia are middle rising powers in quest for status, power and recognition in world affairs. And both of them have been trying to counter Western hegemony in the region and on the international scene. So it is more than natural and more than logical for them to form a sort of coalition or a sort of rapprochement. But the contextual element is obviously this coup. In fact, today President Erdogan feels that he is isolated on the international scene. He is disappointed by the ambiguous position of European leaders vis-à-vis the failed coup d'etat. He's also disappointed by the United States, who are slow to extradite Fethullah Gülen to Turkey. And so he is naturally looking for a new partner who he is founding in Turkey. And vis-à-vis Turkey today, vis-à-vis Russia, today, Russia Putin, his main strategic goal today is to weaken the European Union, is to weaken also NATO. And one way of doing that is to seize the failed coup d'etat as a golden opportunity to attract Erdogan to his own camp and to position himself as a strategic alternative to Turkey instead of NATO, the EU, and the West in general.
Okay, Jana, I want to get back to what you said, but first let me get Dmitry's opinion. Dmitry, do you agree with Jana, at least in part of the context being about Russia and Turkey countering Western hegemony here?
Oh, I think Jana is absolutely right on this theme. I think some of the statements about President Erdogan and the Turkish Republic that came from the European Union, they were just unacceptable. You know, it was a very strange reaction from the West to what happened in Turkey. You know, there was a coup d'etat, an attempt of a coup d'etat. 290 people died. And the reaction from the EU was like, you know, it was all, at least partially, a fault of the Turkish government. Very strange comparisons were made between President Erdogan and President Putin. I think these are two very different leaders. Okay. And what I would like to add to what Jana said and what a professor from Istanbul said, I would also like to add that there were these terrible terrorist acts in Turkey before the attempted coup and after it. I think it also had a role to play because Turkey is obviously interested in having any kind of allies that it can get in fighting terrorism. And in this situation, Russia's help would be valuable. So despite the differences that Turkey and Russia have on Syria, now both countries are facing a much greater threat than anything they had faced before. It is international terrorism. In this situation, Turkey and Russia may leave their differences on Syria aside, at least for some time, until we guarantee the security of our countries.
Well, that's what really needs to be addressed here. You can say they can put those differences on Syria aside, but they are paramount to actually improving the relationship, correct me if I'm wrong, Ahmet, between Russia and Syria. Where can this relationship go if effectively there is a war on Turkey's border that threatens Turkey, where Russia is supporting militarily the opposing side?
That is why, when
well, I would say, if I'm allowed to say...
Let me get Ahmet first, and I'll return to you, Dmitry. Go ahead.
That's right. That is why, when looking at this meeting, we have to see it in terms of short-term, maybe middle range and long-term kind of goals. In the short term, I don't think, let's say in the coming 6 months or a year, I don't think much will change in terms of the position of these two countries on the issue of Syria. Whereas the first thing to start will be in the area of economy. And that's why, from the very early statements of the leaders, what we gather is that they're focusing especially on the support of Mr. Putin regarding the coup attempt in Turkey and economic issues. So energy issue, tourism issue, and so forth. So those areas, I think, will be the first areas that they will work on. Now, if things go well here, and let's also keep in mind that I think in the big picture, what's happening is Turkey is also sending messages to the West. Rightly so, because the response has been very weak from the West to support Turkish democracy. So that is exactly why Turkey is saying, look, here is another important country in the neighborhood, and I can fix my relations, and that will also send a very strong signal to my traditional allies so that they can actually get more bold and more assertive, if you will, in their support for Turkish democracy.
But Dmitry, let me ask you then, could the West, in essence, see this as a bluff, knowing that Turkey and Russia, or at least believing that Turkey and Russia will not be able to reconcile over Syria, which is the very issue that caused this major fallout in the first place?
I don't think so. I think that the European Union and the United States in the last few years, they have been behaving a lot more irrationally than Russia or Turkey, for that matter. I don't know the reasons why the EU and the United States decided to destabilize Libya. Turkey and Russia had their reasons to get involved in the Syrian conflict because we are neighbors with Syria, and of course Turkey cannot be indifferent to the fate of that country. But the EU and the United States certainly had nothing to do with Syria, so their involvement was inexcusable. And let me also tell you that Russia and Turkey have not been trying to teach each other democracy. Unfortunately, the EU is trying to teach everyone. They try to teach Russia, they try to teach Turkey. There are idiotic headlines of articles about Turkey ceasing to be a democracy. These are absolutely unacceptable and just, very irrational statements coming from the European Union. So in the current situation, I believe in an improvement of relations between Russia and Turkey a lot more than in an improvement of relations between Russia and the European Union.
Okay, John.
Why do I think so? I think it's very important. I will just finish very quickly.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to, in terms of economy, I believe in the Turkish Stream a lot more than I believe in the South Stream, the project that Russia had with the European Union. Russia needs to sell its oil and gas to Europe. And unfortunately, the European Union is behaving irrationally. the European Union is foiling the projects that could enrich its southern countries, Greece and Italy. Russia wants to sell its oil and gas to Greece and Italy. Turkey has a powerful leader in charge. It has a parliament in charge. So it's possible to negotiate with Turkey because it is ruled by humans. The European Union is ruled by a machine. Decisions in the EU are taken by the so-called European Council. You can't change these decisions even if you have good relations with individual European leaders or with individual commissioners in the European Commission.
Okay.
So I don't believe in the South Stream, but I believe in the Turkish Stream. And that's why Erdogan is meeting Putin right now.
Jana, let me get straight to you for a response.
Andrea, I think that a reconciliation between Turkey and Russia is more than possible on the Syrian file, and this is for two reasons. The first reason is that both Turkey and Russia today want to regionalize the solution to the Syrian crisis. Both want to make sure that the solution to the Syrian crisis comes from regional powers and from states who are immediately affected by the Syrian situation, and they don't want the solution to come from the West or from any state who is not directly involved in Syria. This is the first reason. The second reason is that my understanding, and this is what I've heard from top advisors of President Erdogan, is Ankara, is the fact that today in Ankara, it seems that they want to re-establish some sort of channels of dialogue with the Syrian regime, not in particular with the president Bashar al-Assad, but with the Syrian regime in general, because Turkey understands today that its policy vis-a-vis Syria has been a complete failure, and so now it is trying to shift its policy. And of course, it is not possible today to re-establish channels of dialogue with the Syrian regime without a possible mediation from Iran and from Russia. And my understanding is that a potential political settlement for the Syrian crisis would take the form of Turkey accepting that the regime in Syria remains in power while Bashar al-Assad departs. And this solution also meets the interests of Russia, because after all, Russia is not sticking to the person of Bashar al-Assad, but it is sticking to the whole configuration of power in Syria. And Russia just wants to make sure that its interests and preferences are respected in Syria. And let me add just one a quick point, which is that I think that what is currently happening in Aleppo, the battle in Aleppo, is nothing more than a preparation for this meeting today in St. Petersburg. Said differently, I do believe that if Turkey is directly or indirectly supporting the opposition today in Aleppo, this is simply to increase the bargaining position of President Erdogan when he's going to negotiate today in St. Petersburg with Putin.
Okay. Amit, if you have a comment, go ahead.
Yes,
if not, I want to...
very briefly, yes, these are, again, that's why I said short-term, long-term. Because let's keep in mind that given the current political situation, in that kind of bargaining, actually, Turkey may not be at its having its strongest hands. So the details of such a bargaining at this point, I have my doubts whether that will actually serve Turkish national interests at this point regarding the solution of the problem in Syria or not. So I think those bargainings may continue, but it may take a while to actually kind of exactly figure out. As you know, as Jana suggested, if the whole strategy would be to separate Assad from the Syrian regime, that would be very interesting to see how it unfolds.
And let's step back for a second, because the fallout between Russia and Turkey had actually culminated in the downing of that Russian jet. But prior to that, we were witnessing a war of words from both nations accusing the other of supporting terrorism. Turkey had said Russia was arming the PKK. Russia said Turkey was assisting terrorist groups in Syria. Jana, does that all just go away now? Has that been forgotten in light of recent events, particularly July 15th?
I think that Ankara has understood that Daesh, that the Islamic State, is a real national security problem for the country. And so now more than ever before, the priority of Ankara is to fight Daesh before making sure that Assad is toppled down. So I think there is a convergence of priorities between Ankara and Moscow on that fact, on you know, the fight against terrorism. And this would participate in a bigger rapprochement between the two parties.
Dmitry, go ahead. You had a comment?
Well, I think that there were a lot of disagreements between Russia and Turkey on Syria, but I think in the light of the new threat emanating from the so-called Islamic State, these things simply can be forgotten. I mean, look at the terrorist acts which the Islamic State managed to organize in Europe and unfortunately in Turkey. Look at the threats which the Islamic State is directing at Russia. These are much more serious matters than PKK or the differences on who should be ruling Syria. This is the national security of Turkey, and this is the national security of Russia. In this situation, I think Russia and Turkey can agree on some kind of a common ground. I think the common ground should be that Syrians themselves should decide who should be their leader. It may be a coalition of parties, it may be a coalition of various political forces, but right now Russia and Turkey can agree on a much more important thing, and that is that we need to fight the radical Islamist threat, the so-called Islamic State. The other important factor is that Russia and Turkey together should resist the irrational policies of the West.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the policies of the European Union are just impossible to explain by the European economic interests.
Okay.
So in this situation, Russia and Turkey should work together for their own security and for their own prosperity.
Okay, Ahmet, let me ask you, if that is the case, if Turkey is indeed moving to a closer, stronger relationship with Russia to counter Western hegemony, as Jana put it, then what happens to NATO? How can Turkey have it essentially both ways, a strong relationship with NATO and an even stronger relationship with Russia?
I think both countries know the recent past. We haven't forgotten that, and you have mentioned some of those issues. Let's keep in mind that Russia-Turkey relations were actually going very well, and once Russia entered into the Syrian war, things have really turned sour. And I believe since then there is a bit of a bitter lesson. I mean, certainly Turkey-Russia relations should be improved, but we have seen that good relations can turn into very sour ones in a very quick period of time. So that is why I believe, yes, both countries want to fix this relationship, but they will also be cautious. And I think there are good reasons for that. As a matter of fact, to build a strong relationship, you should actually take your steps, maybe cautiously, but also strongly, so that it can last for a longer time period. So that's why I think, Turkey-NATO relations will continue, no doubt. On the other hand, Western political leadership in particular has to understand why Turkey is specifically right now willing to improve its relations with Russia after the coup attempt. So there are lessons to be taken out of this for the West as well as the other actors.
Okay, Dmitry, I see you had something to say. Just a quick response, if you can.
Very quickly, I think it's up to NATO to change its policy. It's not up to Turkey. NATO is behaving very aggressively towards Russia. It is deploying troops on the border with Russia, 4 battalions in just the last few months. Obviously, Turkey doesn't want to be dragged into confrontation with Russia simply because NATO has invented this phantom threat of Russia attacking Eastern Europe. So NATO needs to change. It's not Turkey or Russia who need to change. NATO should stop its aggressive policies towards Russia and Syria,
Okay.
and NATO should stop its aggressive rhetoric against Turkey.
Okay, Dimitri, I'm not quite sure that's going to happen, but let me ask Jana, first of all, if you think NATO could actually change its stance towards Russia, or are we looking at a Turkey that might have to sacrifice one relationship for the other? It's Turkey-Russia relationship versus Turkey-NATO relationship. Go ahead.
Well, I think that Turkey has always been very pragmatic in terms of balancing its relations with Russia, with its relations with the EU and NATO. In fact, it's not in the best interest of Turkey today to completely turn its back to the West. First of all, in terms of economy, the Turkish economy is very, very much interdependent on European investment. Second, in terms of security, Turkish security is very much dependent on NATO. And there is an element, a third element, which is extremely important, which is that Turkey's regional standing is very much linked to Turkey's EU anchor. In fact, in the past few years, Turkey was able to gain in soft power and gain in prestige on the Middle Eastern level because it presented itself as a Muslim country who was candidate to the EU. So if Turkey today loses its EU and its NATO anchor, then probably it would lose much of its image and prestige and reputation and soft power in the Middle East. So today it's just a question of balancing for Turkey. And I think that the establishment, the Turkish establishment, is very much pragmatic in terms of what it is doing. So now it is simply showing the West, showing EU and NATO that, look, we have a new partner now. We have Russia. So if you continue humiliating us, if you continue pushing us outside the borders of the EU, then you will lose us. But I think that this will never actually happen.
Okay, Jana Jalbar, I'm going to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. And you have been watching The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks so much for joining us. Goodbye.